Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm Tahir Dhindsa and you're watching SDTV. Inflation, monetary policy, fiscal deficit, lack of it or abundance of it, foreign resources, these are issues nowadays. From average Pakistanis to academicians to policymakers, they're all perturbed. And no one is on the same page. And I personally understand, and economists agree with me, that clearing the narrative and the understanding, making the picture clear, crystal clear, is more important than doing other measures on the ground. So we have today with us a person who played an important part in the central bank, State Bank of Pakistan, when he was working here. And now he's with the UNESCAP and he's director Macroeconomy, Mr. Hamza Ali Malik. Very warm welcome. Would you like to say a few sentences as a basic premise so we can go rumble on further at not introduction, but on the international scale? How do you compare 53 countries and economy? What is the international scenario?
You used the word narrative setting. Let's start with that. So,
Right.
For instance, I work for the United Nations now. So, we are in the world of narrative making around sustainable development goals. Narrative making exercise of that goal is actually much more different than people normally assume. They normally tend to go in terms of these are the goals, this is the progress towards the goals, this is the gap, so on and so forth. But if you talk at a slightly more aggregated, bigger level, the impact of that is it has and it is and it will be changing the narrative. What do I mean by that? The current narrative, dominant narrative in the world economy in general, including Asia Pacific, including Pakistan, is that the maximization of material well-being, in common parlance we call it GDP growth, is the ultimate objective of societies or economies and policymakers. It has become a yardstick of success for policymakers, right? Countries performing well on this yardstick are perceived successful. Those who are lagging behind are considered not doing that well. What the SDG or 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the narrative making exercise is, we're talking about now saying inequality should be part and parcel of policy considerations, not as an afterthought, but as an embedded, integral part of policy making. Similarly, environment considerations in a broader sense, be it climate change, biodiversity, so air pollution, so on and so forth, should be part of policy making. The traditional current dominant narrative is all about let's pursue material well-being now, maximization of GDP growth now. Once we become a slightly richer or achieve a certain level, then we will deal with the environment problem. Then we will try and address inequality concerns through some policy instruments and so on and so forth. It is much lower in terms of priorities of policymakers. What we are arguing as a whole, what I've learned which should be arguing as a whole, working in the United Nations, is these three should be, broadly speaking, these economic, social, and environment considerations, basically maximization of GDP growth, inequality, and environment, should be the primary objective and considered simultaneously. It will inform the trade-offs involved in policy making. So when policymakers, for instance, are considering changes in interest rates, for instance, or introducing some taxation, it should not be only looked through the perspective of what is the likely impact going to be on GDP growth. We should also pay attention to and address and respond accordingly. What are the impacts going to be on inequalities and environment dimensions? That's the narrative changing exercise I think the Sustainable Development Agenda is trying to do, and I'm part of that, very happy to be part of that.
How would you color the rubric international? How would you color the rubric? I mean, how would you compare with each other regions and the countries and what you call it? Just if somebody want to understand where we are, we need a reference. But there are multiple references across the world. How would you compare it? What picture you would give?
Let me share a very interesting piece of information, and then you'll see where Pakistan is faring. We do this. I lead actually that publication called Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. It is the oldest publication of its kind in the region since 1947.
Yeah.
Way before IMF or World Bank or ADB or OECD or many organizations were producing a regional level big picture on development and so on and so forth. Until 1978, that was the only publication. And then IMF and World Bank started producing their own reports. Later on, countries produced their own reports. So we have a good 70+ year of history of understanding the region in Asia and the Pacific. Back in 2012, we did a survey of the survey. So we looked at the past, 60, 70 years, and tried to draw fundamental lessons. So back in 50s, when the kind of debates we were having, it was thought at that time that Myanmar is going to be, or Rangoon is going to be the next biggest city or economy of Asia. This is early 50s, right? Not Tokyo, not Singapore, not the cities or countries that we know now are way ahead of other countries or the peers in Asia and the Pacific. It was identified the most promising country and cities going to be Rangoon and Myanmar at that time, right? We know now Myanmar is nowhere near. It is considered a least developed country, is really struggling on multiple fronts. So when you look through this lens of history, you draw very clear lessons. One of the fundamental lessons in case of at least Myanmar is the army, the military started interfering in the economy. They actually took over in 50s and they never went back. There's still the same problem. To me, that's one example of one of the fundamental problems any developing countries face when they don't develop, in the broader sense, a governing structure. Democracy is one example of that. It doesn't have to be that, although that helps a lot. But you cannot have an unfunctioning economic structure, structural society under which an economy functions. You cannot have disruptions. You have one approach, a model working, let's say a parliament, and then the military takes over a few years and then so forth. Do you see a lot of resonance we have that in case in Pakistan, right?
Replica.
That's the similar situation we have had in Pakistan, for instance. So Pakistan back then in the 60s, people used to call it, oh, it could be as good as Korea. It was doing extremely well compared to its peers, right up until the 80s and 90s. Now, 90s onwards, if you do the similar exercise just for your interest with South Asia, for instance, Pakistan was ahead on several indicators, not just economic, social indicators as well, compared to Bangladesh, compared to India, Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was ahead in some social indicators, but by and large, Pakistan economy was considered much stronger, had much more promise. Look at us now. Nowhere near our own peers in the sub-region of South Asia, let alone trying to compete with the likes of Singapore or Japan or many other very well-established, or even South Korea for that matter, those countries. So history teaches a lot, that's what I'm trying to say. And then what it teaches you is one should pay attention to that. We get engaged in day-to-day conversations into quarterly GDP dynamics, one crisis or the other, political crisis or the other. That's a very short-term lens. Here and there, we should zoom out and try and learn how other countries have developed.
On a bigger scale.
On a bigger scale. So
timeline.
Exactly. If I can zoom out globally, similar example. Costa Rica is a beacon of example in South Asia, Central America, right? Where did that come from? Botswana in Africa. You study these cases, those countries who have gone past with their peers, they have done something right. One of the fundamental things is putting institutions and governance structures in place and clearly. That's what does the job.
I often think, because I'm not an economist, I'm not an historian as well, so it becomes...
Every economist should be a historian, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Economic history is the history.
Actually. You learn a lot from that.
Yeah. So sometime I need help on that, and I keep on thinking. Then in 1990 or 92, when simultaneously we did reform, we make rupee convertible and all reforms here, and across the border, Manmohan Singh, India was 6 times bigger than us at that time in population-wise. And the economy was 4 times larger than us. And today it is still 6 times bigger than us. And the economy is at least 12 times larger than us. Yeah. And in these times, General Musharraf's military takeover was there, yes. But it gave Pakistan at least, what they say, it's different, $32 billion of injection through reprofiling and all that. So what happened to Pakistan?
We never internalized the reforms that were needed. They were always piecemeal. India did internalize that in 91 that you're referring to, Manmohan Singh's major reforms, liberalization or opening up of India's economy. And that helped set the stage.
Although rupee is still not fully convertible.
Fair enough. They say it. It's been piecemeal, right? Chinese did the same thing. They started opening up in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. And then they have this Chinese proverb, which essentially conveys the basic message. They say, we will cross the river by feeling each stone under our feet.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? What they mean by that is we'll go very gradual, very deliberate, very reflective mode, slowly and steadily. We know the general direction that we're going to go in this way, cross the river, but we don't go in a rush. We won't be dictated by others what to do that. Every country looks at their internal mechanisms and the structures of societies, capacity of policy making, and so on and so forth to go ahead. China done the same thing. India started in 91. Bangladesh started in 2000s late. Every country has done that. What is the difference with Pakistan? They all sustained these reforms and built on them. We never did that. I was talking about this governance structure tussle between military and civilian rulership. That's one example. But even in the pure policy-making world, we never sustained these efforts. We talk about reforming our tax systems. There is a Qamar Hussain Commission report in 1985 talking about, you read it today, it looks like it's been written last week, highlighting the same issues with the Pakistan tax structure, for instance.
Yeah.
There have been a talk of reforming the economy on fundamental grounds, be it taxation or public sector, energy, and so on and so forth. It's been there for a while. So one fundamental lesson, any countries that have taken off, they have sustained the reforms and policy momentum. There's no right or wrong answer. That's what I'm trying to say. Every country can go the different path. But as long as you sustain that, and that requires a lot of work. It's not automatic. You really have to have the capacity to internalize that agenda. You have to create political constituency for reform. We don't have that. We have Pakistan has a very, very segmented economic structure. In most plain words, if I can call it, the structures are serving a very small minority, you can call it elites of the society, not the general masses. It's not geared for that. It is deliberate and it's being perpetuated.
Yes.
So you get pockets of brilliance here and there, be it a game of cricket or economy performance or whatever, but it's not going to be sustained at all.
Yeah.
Unless and until you genuinely say, this is the direction I want to go, these are the steps I'm going to take. In many areas, we can discuss some specifics if you're interested, and then you take steps. South Korea has the same example, the East Asian Tigers they call it. You talk about Vietnam, you talk about Philippines. How did they take off? They invested very heavily in people, essentially education and health primarily. That's made the difference. And they sustained it across military takeovers, across civilian rulership, across economic hardships. They sustained that.
The policy continued.
Policy continuity, that's the simple word of that. Yeah. That does the difference.
Yeah, Hamza, thank you very much. Obviously, it's very interesting. I don't want to finish it now. I want to carry on. But for the scarcity of the time, I think we have to end the program. We're looking forward to, even if you go back to your job, we'll keep recording program through electronic, digital mean as well. And one lesson that clearly comes is that consumer or the biggest consumer or the institutional consumers should not be the policymaker. This seems to be a big lesson. And I will quote here on the other side, on the flip side, I would quote Will Durant. He said that the first lesson we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. Goodbye.